He kept her alive, then the church took him from her. For 6 years, Leora has been given only 30 minutes a week with Reneth, the healer, and now lives as the Saint of Solian, sacred, untouchable, and no longer his own. But when she finally tells him what she truly feels, it shatters the fragile world they've survived inside. What follows is a doomed flight from the church, from duty, and from the truth they can no longer avoid. If she no longer needs saving, can their love survive what remains? If you love dark fantasy romance and painful obsessive love stories, like and subscribe for more. The Saint in the Glass Garden. Chapter 1. 30 Minutes in the Sanctum. Leora knew every note of it by now. The way a prisoner knows the dimensions of a cell by footfall count. The way a woman knows a lover's body without ever having undressed him. She sat on the treatment chair with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, a picture of ducal composure. The chair was carved from pale wood and padded with white linen. It was meant to look merciful. She had sat in it every week for 6 years. Reneth knelt before her, not because she was noble and he was not, because the treatment required it. One hand at the pulse point on her wrist, the other pressed flat just above her heart, where the damaged tissue in her lungs sat closest to the surface. His palms were warm. They were always warm. The heat sank through her bodice like sunlight through glass, loosening the tight, wet knot that lived between her ribs. Behind them, Brother Taven sat on a wooden stool near the door, his breviary open on his knee. He was new. The last chaperone had been old Father Garin, whose hearing was unreliable and whose attention wandered. Taven was young, attentive, and clearly under orders to notice everything. The frost held longer this year, Leora said. Reneth's lashes flickered. He did not look up. His thumb shifted fractionally against her pulse. The roots are deep enough. They'll hold. This was how they spoke, had spoken since childhood, when a glasshouse full of flowers gave them a vocabulary no one else could parse. Frost meant loneliness. Roots meant endurance. They'll hold meant I'm still here. I found a cracked pane in the east wall, she said. The draft came through all winter. Translation: I've been cold and you weren't there. His jaw tightened. She watched the muscle move beneath skin that the cathedral kept immaculate. Shaved, smooth, oiled, dressed in white and gold as though holiness were a costume. His hair was longer than when they were children, pale gold falling past his collar, caught back with a leather cord. They groomed him like a relic. He was 20 years old. I'll send word to the gardener, he said quietly. Translation: I know. I'm sorry. I can't reach you. The heat from his hands deepened. She felt it spread through her sternum, loosening mucus she hadn't known was there, easing the constant shallow ache that was Miss Lung's signature, as if her chest were a room he was unlocking one bolt at a time. Her breath came easier. It always came easier near him. That was the problem. On the side table beside the treatment chair, beneath a folded altar cloth, she could see the corner of documents bearing the red and silver seal of Iron. Prince Noel's duchy, the king's own brother, and the most politically dangerous man in the kingdom. She had studied that seal in her father's correspondence for months, piecing together fragments. She sighed. Time, Brother Taven said from his stool. His voice was apologetic, but firm. Reneth's hands stilled. He withdrew them slowly, the way he always did, as if separation required the same deliberateness as touch. Leora felt the cold rush back into her chest like water into a footprint. She stood, smoothed her skirts, looked at him. He was already rising, his expression settling into the serene mask the cathedral had spent years perfecting. Saint of Solian, the once-in-2 centuries miracle. A boy who could draw sickness out through his hands and who belonged, now and forever, to God. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it for weeks. I wish to make a private confession, she said. Taven looked up. Reneth went still. My lady, Taven began, the session has concluded. Any communicant of the cathedral may request confession from a consecrated vessel of Solian. Leora kept her voice level, pleasant, aristocratic. I looked it up. in the Solionite rite. The saint is bound to hear it. The silence in the room was very specific. It was the silence of a man who has been given a key and is terrified to use it. Raneth said, "Of course." The confessional was small and smelled of wax. The screen between them was carved wood, intricate enough to obscure features, but thin enough that she could see the shape of him, the pale blur of his face, the gold of his hair, the rise and fall of his breathing. He was close enough to touch if she pushed her fingers through the lattice. She didn't. "Hear my confession, Father. She said, and stopped. Raneth waited. He was trained in waiting. The cathedral had made him excellent at it. "I have nothing to confess," she said. "I don't have sins except I have 30 minutes a week and a language made of flowers, and I am so tired of both." She heard his breath catch. It was a small sound, barely audible, and it cost her everything. "I miss you." The words came out flat and plain and without decoration, and they were the most terrifying things she had ever said to him, because they left no room for metaphor. "I miss you, Reneth. I'm still holding on to this hope that you'd come back to me, the boy in the glass house. I miss him every single day, and I have been saying it in code for 6 years, because I was afraid that if I said it plainly, you would do exactly what you're about to do." Through the screen, she watched him press his hand over his mouth. The gesture was achingly familiar. He'd done it as a child when he was trying not to cry. "What you're feeling," he said, and his voice had gone formal, careful, coated in doctrine like sugar overwrought. His gratitude, it's natural. The bond between healer and supplicant can create a sense of, "Reneth, stop." He stopped. "Tell me you don't miss me," she said. "Say it plainly. Not in code, not in doctrine. Say I don't miss you, Leora, and I will leave this confessional, and I will accept my father's proposal, and I will marry the prince, and you will never have to hear me say it again." The silence stretched. Through the lattice, she watched him bow his head. She watched his shoulders draw up. She watched him fail. "I can't say that," he whispered. "Then say what you truly mean," she desperately urged. Raneth fumbled. I don't know what you—" "Yes, you do," she cut off. "Because why else would you keep letting me? It's either you fight for me, or you tell me to let go." Another silence. His hand moved to the screen. His fingertips pressed against the wood from his side, as if he could reach her through ornamental theology. "The garden misses its warmest season," he said. "Code. Still code, after everything." Leora stood. Her chair scraped stone. She pushed through the curtain and left him there in the dark with his metaphors, and his God, and his cowardice. And she did not cry until she reached the carriage. That night, Duke Albrecht Velden summoned her to his study. He was a broad man, run slightly to softness, his dark hair silvered at the temples, his hands scarred from decades of falconry and governance. He poured wine he knew she wouldn't drink, and sat across from her in a chair that had belonged to 4 generations of Veldens. "The negotiations have reached a formal stage," he said. "You're to wed Prince Noel." Leora's fingers curled in her lap. "When?" "The proposal arrived 3 weeks ago. I've been reviewing terms." He paused. "His physicians are progressing well with mistlung. It can be treated. Sustainably. Without—" He gestured vaguely toward the cathedral visible through the study window, its spire bone white against the evening sky. "Without Reneth," she said. Albrecht flinched. He recovered quickly, but she had seen it. "Without miracle dependence, yes. Noel's younger sister survived early-stage mistlung under a new vapor regimen, heat treatment, mineral compounds, monitored breathing. He funded an entire medical institute in Erin after her recovery. He is ambitious." "Ambitious," Leora repeated. "Is that what we're calling it when the king's brother offers to buy a duke's daughter with medicine?" She said softly, "As if this illness is why I ever needed Reneth." His face darkened, and for a moment she saw something older than anger, something exhausted. But he only said, "You are an adult and you are expected to act like one. This attachment to that boy must cease this instant. I expect you to collect yourself and finally act like you're carrying the name of Velden on your back like I have. So you will meet the prince, and that is not a request." She left. On her way to her rooms, she passed the portrait gallery. Her mother's painting hung in the alcove nearest the staircase. Mariette Velden, golden-haired, clear-eyed, dead at 31 from the same illness now closing Leora's airways by imperceptible degrees. She heard her father before she saw him. The study door had not fully closed, and his voice carried, not shouting, but the hoarse, broken register of a man speaking to someone who could not answer. "This will be over soon, Mariette. Will daughter shall live." Leora pressed herself against the corridor wall and did not move until the sound of weeping stopped. Chapter 2. Boy of Dust and Sunlight. She was 7 when the carriage came back wrong. Leora had been watching from the yew-shadowed edge of the east garden, where the gravel drive curved past the stables, and the air smelled of horse sweat and hedge clippings. Her father had been gone 3 days on ducal business, inspecting roads, settling a land dispute, the sort of thing that bored her thoroughly. She was waiting only because waiting was what she did. The house was large, and her lungs were bad, and the servants were kind but careful, and careful people were not interesting. The carriage was ordinary. Her father's face was not. Albrecht Velden descended with the look of a man who had found something miraculous, and was already calculating what it would cost him. He reached back into the carriage and lifted down a boy. The boy was small and thin and filthy, maybe 6 or 7, with hair so pale it looked like raw sunlight caught in cobwebs. His feet were bare and cut. His clothes were road-stained beyond color. He stood where Albrecht placed him and did not move, did not speak, did not look up. And something about his stillness made Leora's chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with Mistlung. She learned the story in pieces over the following days, gathered from servants' whispers and her father's uncharacteristically distracted silences. Albrecht's party had come upon an overturned cart on the southern road. The carter was pinned, his legs shattered, bone visible. The boy had been crouching beside him in the ditch. When Albrecht's men approached, the boy pressed his small hands flat against the carter's ruined leg, and the bone moved, knitted, sealed beneath closing skin, while blood ran from the child's own nose, and fine cracks of silver-red strain spread beneath the skin of his forearms, like fault lines in porcelain. The carter walked within the hour. The boy collapsed and did not wake for a day and a half. Albrecht brought him home. Go to him, her father told Leora on the 3rd morning, when the boy was sitting in the kitchen garden staring at nothing, a bowl of porridge, untouched, beside him. Take him to the glass house. Make a friend, my gentle daughter. She was never allowed to make friends with anyone, especially not peasants, until now. The thought of making a real friend made her curious and frightened, and oddly proprietary, the way she felt about injured birds she found in the garden, aware that the world had hurt something small, and certain she was the right person to answer for it. She crossed the kitchen garden and stood in front of him. Up close, his eyes were gray-green, large, and absolutely empty of expectation. "I'm Leora," she said. "Do you have a name?" "Reneth is what the Duke named me." His voice was barely there. "Are you hungry?" He looked at the porridge. "I don't know." "Come with me," she said, and offered her hand. He took it the way a drowning person takes a rope, not with trust, but with the absence of any other option. His palm was hot, unnaturally, wonderfully hot, like holding a stone that had been sitting in the sun. The glass house was Leora's kingdom. It sat at the south end of the estate gardens, a long, low structure of iron and glass panes, half of them mended, some replaced with oilcloth, when funds ran short. Inside, the air was warm and damp and heavy with the green exhalation of growing things, and it was the only place on the estate where Leora's lungs didn't hurt as much. She showed Reneth the roses first, then the ferns, then the seedlings she had planted herself in clay pots she'd painted with her mother's old brushes. "This one's a peony," she said, pointing to a pot of dirt that showed nothing yet. "It won't bloom for 2 years. You have to be patient with peonies." Raneth knelt beside the pot and touched the soil with one finger. "I can feel it," he said quietly. "Underneath." "Feel what?" He looked up at her, and for the first time his expression held something other than blankness. "It wants to grow." Leora sat beside him on the warm stone floor and decided, with the absolute certainty available only to 7-year-olds, that this boy was hers. They built their language that first year. It happened the way all childhood languages happen, from need, proximity, and the particular genius of children for making the world mean more than adults intend. Roses meant, "I'm here." A cracked pane meant, "Something's wrong, don't ask in front of them." Winter soil pressed between small fingers and offered solemnly meant, "I'm sorry." An unruly vine pointed to with a conspiratorial grin meant, "I hate the new tutor," or "the cook burned the bread," or simply, "Isn't this ridiculous?" They had time. They had the glass house. They had each other. What they didn't have was permission. Every evening, Reneth was led back to a small room at the top of the servants' wing, where the housekeeper kept a careful eye and a careful distance. He was not a guest. He was not a servant. He was something Albrecht had not yet decided how to name, which meant everyone treated him with the nervous courtesy reserved for objects that might be valuable or might be dangerous. Leora didn't care. She cared that his hands were warm and that when he touched her wrist during a coughing fit, the tightness eased. She cared that he laughed at her jokes and cried when baby birds fell from nests and could name every wildflower in the hedgerow. She cared that when they fell asleep together on the glass house floor, curled like two cats in a patch of sun, his heat sank into her chest and let her breathe. The maids were always the ones who pulled them apart. A knock on the glass house door, a firm hand on Leora's shoulder, a murmured, "That's enough now, my lady." Almost every time, within hours, the coughing would start again, wet, racking deep enough to taste copper, and her father would appear in her doorway, with his jaw set and his guilt written across his face, and he would say, "Let the boy sit with her." Raneth would come. He would place his hands over her ribs and pour heat into her until the coughing stopped and his own skin turned ashen and his nose bled into his sleeve. He never complained. He never refused. He was 8, 9, 10 years old, and he had already learned that his body was a tool and that the price of being kept was being used. Leora was too young to see it. She saw only that he came when she needed him, and that his presence was the difference between breathing and drowning. She built love on that foundation, without knowing the foundation was quicksand. Later, she would understand and come to hate herself and her father for it. But that year, and the next after that, the glass house was the whole world, and the world was warm, and Reneth was there so she could breathe. Chapter 3. The bargain at Velden. For 5 years, the balance held. It held because Albrecht Velden was a careful man. He understood what he possessed, not merely a healer, but a saint, a once-in-2 centuries vessel of Solian's grace, the kind of living miracle that had founded dynasties and started wars. He understood that such a possession was both priceless and unsustainable. He kept Reneth hidden, the way a man keeps a stolen painting, not behind locked doors, which invite questions, but in plain sight, reclassified as something mundane. Reneth was the Duke's ward, a foundling taken in from charity, a quiet golden-haired boy who helped in the gardens and kept the Duke's sickly daughter company. Nothing more. It almost worked. The trouble was winter. Specifically, the winter Leora was 10, when a brutal cold settled over the duchy, and the estate workers began falling ill, not with mist lung, but with the common fevers and infections that cold and poverty always bring. A stable hand's arm went septic. A laundress developed a cough that turned bloody. A forester's child burned with a fever that wouldn't break. Albrecht permitted a handful of healings. Secretly, at night, in the back rooms of the servants' quarters. Reneth was 11. He pressed his hot hands to rotting flesh and burning foreheads, and did what his body had been made to do, and each time it cost him. Trembling, nosebleeds, a fever of his own that lasted days and left him gray-skinned and hollow-eyed. Albrecht paid for silence with coin and oath. He was thorough. He was nearly thorough enough. But one impossible recovery, the forester's child, who had been given last rites and then sat up the next morning asking for porridge, traveled farther than coin could contain. A visiting merchant mentioned it at a roadside inn. A cathedral clerk overheard. Questions were raised. Letters were sent. Archcanon Severin arrived on a gray morning in late autumn, when the yews were bare and the glasshouse panes were rimed with frost. Leora was 12. She had grown tall for her age, thin from illness, ashen hazelnut-like hair like her father, with her mother's mouth and her mother's habit of listening at doors. She pressed herself against the wall outside her father's study and listened as Severin dismantled every lie Albrecht had built. Severin's voice was like polished stone, smooth, cold, faultless. He rejected Albrecht's cover story with the precision of a surgeon cutting away dead tissue, a bleeding child taken in from pity, a foundling with an unusual constitution, a coincidence of recoveries. "Your Grace," Severin said, and the courtesy was a blade. The boy healed a compound fracture on the southern road. The carter is still telling the story. He healed your estate workers during the worst of the cold. One of them told her sister. Her sister told a clerk. The clerk told me. And when I examined the evidence, the speed of recovery, the silver-red marks on the healer's skin, the pattern of exhaustion afterward, I recognized what the church has not seen in 187 years. A pause. Then Albrecht's voice, strained but controlled. "He is a child under my protection. He is the saint of Solian, and you have been hiding him." The argument that followed lasted 3 hours. Leora heard most of it. She understood about half. What she understood was this. Severin could not simply seize Reneth. Not cleanly. Reneth was physically unstable from overuse. The winter healings had pushed him past safe limits, and his body was still recovering. He panicked when separated from Leora. The one time Albrecht had tried to move him to a different wing of the house, the boy had stopped eating and shattered every glass in his room with a pulse of uncontrolled energy that left hairline cracks in the plaster. And Albrecht, for all his compromised morality, was a duke. He could threaten scandal, church abduction of a child under noble protection. And the threat had weight. They reached an agreement. It was called a compromise. It was a surrender with terms. The church would take Reneth. He would be installed at Solian Cathedral, trained, consecrated, presented to the nation as the saint he was. In exchange, Leora would be granted a private weekly audience and treatment session. 1 hour, supervised, within the cathedral's inner sanctum. 1 hour, Albrecht said, and his voice had gone hollow. "The saint's duties will be extensive," Severin replied. "I'm sure you understand." Within a year, 1 hour had become 30 minutes. Within 2 years, the supervising priest had become a permanent fixture. Within 3, Reneth had been shaved, oiled, dressed in white and gold, and taught to speak in blessings. But by then, the language of the glass house was already built, already fluent, already the only place where either of them sounded human, and Leora carried it into the cathedral every week like a lantern into a crypt. The day they took him, she ran, not away, toward. She ran down the gravel drive after the church carriage, barefoot, coughing, screaming his name until her father caught her and held her against his chest, while she fought him with fists and nails, and the desperate fury of a child who has just learned that love does not protect you from anything. Reneth watched from the carriage window. His face was white. His hands were pressed flat against the glass. She could see the cracks spreading under his skin. Chapter 4. The Hothouse Alphabet. 6 years of 30-minute visits laid end to end would total approximately 156 hours. 156 hours to contain the entire private life of 2 people who had once shared every waking moment. They learned economy. The first visit, Leora was 12 and trembling. The cathedral was vast, cold, and smelled of incense and stone. Reneth was already changed, his hair washed and combed, his feet in soft-soled slippers, his body wrapped in a white novice's robe that made him look like a candle. The treatment room was not yet the sanctum. That came later, after consecration. but a plain stone chamber with a chair and a crucifix, and an old priest named Father Anselm, who sat in the corner and pretended to read. Reneth put his hands on her ribs and said, "The frost was harsh." "I missed you," she said. "The greenhouse held. I survived." And that was how it began. Over months, then years, the code grew. It became intricate, layered, capable of carrying meaning that would have horrified the priests if they'd understood. A reference to roses in full bloom meant, "I dreamed of you." A wilting stem meant, "I'm angry, and I can't tell you why." A vine that needed cutting meant, "Someone hurt me today." Cracked glass meant, "I'm breaking." They spoke of frost and roots and soil conditions while Reneth's hands drew sickness from her chest, and the priests heard nothing but gardening. Leora, at 13, thin, sharp, furious. She had read every botanical text in her father's library and secretly handed notes during her visits to share the weaponized vocabulary. She could describe an entire emotional landscape in the language of horticulture while maintaining the placid expression of a noble woman discussing her hobby. One visit that year, she arrived with a bruise on her forearm from a fall during a coughing fit on the estate stairs. Reneth took her wrist for the pulse check and went still. "Who?" he said, not in code. "The stairs. I missed a step." He turned her arm gently, examining the bruise with an intensity that had nothing to do with healing. Father Anselm coughed from his corner. Reneth placed her arm back in her lap with exaggerated care. "The vine on the south wall," he said, his voice perfectly even, "has been growing wild. No one tends it. No one is taking care of you. It's a hardy variety," she said. "It doesn't need tending. I can handle it." His eyes said he didn't believe her, but the priest was watching, and the clock was counting, and there were only 11 minutes left, so he pressed his hands to her ribs and said nothing more. And the heat he poured into her that day felt less like medicine and more like fury. Reneth, at 14, taller, thinner, beginning to develop the luminous, androgynous beauty the cathedral was cultivating. His cheekbones emerged, his voice deepened, and then was trained into softness. He wore white always, gold on holy days. His hands, which had once been dirty from garden soil, were kept immaculate. Leora, at 15, the visit that changed everything about how she understood herself. She was late that day. A wheel on the carriage had cracked, and they'd waited 40 minutes for a replacement. She arrived at the Sanctum with her chest tight from the cold walk up the cathedral steps, her breath coming in the short, shallow pulls that meant her lungs were at their worst. But the moment she crossed the threshold, before Reneth had risen from his chair, before he had touched her, before anything at all had happened, her chest loosened. Not fully, not the dramatic bloom of a healing session, but perceptibly, unmistakably, her airways relaxed. She took a breath that was deeper than any she'd managed all morning. She sat in the treatment chair. Reneth knelt and placed his hands in position. "The frost," he began. "Wait," she said. He waited. She breathed, in and out, carefully, testing. The tightness was still there but muted, held at bay by, what? His proximity, the room itself, the accumulated weight of 150 visits in which this space, this posture, this man's presence had meant relief. "What is it?" Reneth asked. "Nothing," she said. "Continue." But it was not nothing. That night she lay in bed and ran the arithmetic with the cold precision of someone dissecting her own heart. Every week, the same corridor, the same door, the same chair, the same hands, the same easing of breath. For 3 years her body had made the association, linked this sequence of stimuli to the response of opening, relaxing, yielding. She had been trained by sheer repetition. Her lungs had learned him the way a hunting dog learns the horn, which meant that some portion of what she felt when she entered the Sanctum, the rush of warmth, the sudden ease, the overwhelming sense of rightness, was love. Is it? Then hurriedly, she buried the thought. She buried it so deep and so violently that the burial itself became a kind of evidence. You do not bury things that don't threaten you. Reneth at 16. The visit, she could not forget. The supervising priest that week was Father Aldrich, who sat closer than Anselm and watched with sharper eyes. Reneth's hands were on Leora's ribs, the treatment proceeding normally. When he spoke in a register she had never heard from him before, halting, almost ashamed, as if he were confessing a wound rather than reciting a lesson. Saints must not claim private desire, he said. His voice was barely above a murmur, pitched just beneath Aldrich's hearing. For when healing becomes appetite, the gift turns inward and devours. Desire unmakes the vessel. The vessel must remain empty to be filled. Leora kept her face neutral. Inside, something went very still. Who taught you that? She asked. The Archcanon. It's from the Solionite commentaries. 3rd canon. He paused. His fingers pressed fractionally harder against her ribs. She wanted to scream. She wanted to pull his hands from her chest and hold them and tell him that desire was not destruction, that wanting something for himself did not make him profane, that the men who taught him emptiness was holiness had done so, because an empty vessel is easier to carry. She smiled instead and said, "Spring comes whether the soil believes in it or not." His fingers twitched against her sternum. He did not answer. The more ornate the cathedral made him, gilded vestments, jeweled clasps, ceremonial oils that made his skin gleam, the more the code became the only place where he sounded like a person. In public he blessed, intoned, healed with graceful choreography. In the sanctum, with his hands on her lungs and his voice low enough to slip beneath the priest's attention, he was still Reneth, still the boy who could feel a peony wanting to grow. But the boy was disappearing. She could see it happening, visit by visit, like watching erosion. His edges were being sanded smooth, his silences grew longer, his smiles grew more practiced. And still she came, every week, 30 minutes, because her lungs needed him, because she needed him, because she had never learned the difference. Brother Taven was assigned to chaperone duties in the final year. He was 22, recently ordained, and sincere in the way that young men are sincere before institutions have finished reshaping them. His first week, he watched Reneth kneel before Leora and heal her lungs, and afterward he asked Father Aldrich a question that had occurred to him during the session. Does anyone ask the saint if he wants to do this? Aldrich looked at him with the patient condescension of a man who has stopped asking inconvenient questions. The saint is consecrated. He does not want, he serves. Taven wrote this in his journal that evening, intending it as a reminder of doctrine. Reading it back, it sounded like something else entirely. At 18, she broke the pattern. I miss you. Not code, not metaphor. Plain speech, in a confessional, where the truth should theoretically be welcome. He answered with doctrine. She left, and something irreversible began. Chapter 5. Plain speech. She stopped reaching, not abruptly. Leora was too practiced for that. She arrived at her appointments on time, sat in the chair, submitted to treatment. She was warm, polite, even conversational. She discussed the weather, the real weather, not their weather. She asked after the cathedral's charity programs. She inquired about the new stained glass commission in the south transept. She did not use the code. She did not touch his wrist. She did not look at him with anything more than pleasant aristocratic interest. And the absence of everything she was withholding filled the room like smoke. Reneth healed her lungs. His hands trembled. In their third session of this new regime, he said, "The eastern pain, I had it repaired," she said lightly. "It's fine now." Translation: "I don't need your sympathy." He flinched as if she'd struck him. Leora watched the flinch and felt powerful and sick in equal measure. Her father presented the proposal on a Tuesday evening, in the same study, in the same chairs. This time, he did not pour wine. He laid documents on the desk between them and spoke with the controlled precision of a man who has rehearsed. Prince Noel of Iron, 26, younger brother of King Noah, which made him the second most powerful man in the kingdom, and the most dangerous, because a younger brother with ambition and no throne is a man who must build power from something other than inheritance. He had chosen medicine. after his younger sister, Princess Margot, survived early-stage mist lung under a new vapor-based treatment. Noel had funded a medical institute in his Duchy of Iron. Heat, mineral compounds, structured breathing exercises, bitter tinctures that tasted of iron and pine. The institute had treated 43 patients. 31 showed significant improvement. 12 were functionally cured. The church had tried to suppress the results. King Noah, whose legitimacy depended in part on the saint system's monopoly on healing, had allowed the suppression. Noel had published anyway. A union with Velden, Albrecht said carefully, would allow you to receive continued treatment outside the church's supervision. It would also shield the duchy from any future inquiry into Reneth's childhood. He paused, and she could see him weighing how much to say. But I won't pretend this is only about your lungs. Velden controls the northern trade corridor, the only viable route for the mineral compounds Noel's treatment requires. Without our roads and our harbors, his entire medical program depends on supply lines that Noah and the church can cut at will. A marriage binds our territory to his reform faction. It makes the treatment infrastructure permanent and politically protected. Leora stared at the documents. The Irene seal glowed dully in the lamplight. So I'm not just medicine, she said. I'm a trade route. Albrecht's face tightened. You are my daughter, and you are dying. Those two facts have never stopped being true, and they have never stopped being in conflict with everything else. 2 years. 2 years of her father quietly constructing an exit while she sat in a white chair every week and poured her heart into botanical metaphor. 2 years of him watching her walk into the cathedral and knowing he was building the door that would eventually close behind her. My body, she said, and her voice was very controlled, is not a negotiating position. Your body, Albrecht replied, and his voice was not controlled at all, is dying. If the king's own brother and his physicians are the price of your breath, then yes, Leora, I will pay it, and I will let you hate me for the rest of your extremely long life. Why not also pay for Reneth's while you're at it? She answered with venom. The Duke became furious. Leave, you ungrateful child. She immediately regretted those words. All her father ever did was to keep her alive. But this anger and deep-rooted resentment towards exploiting an innocent child, whom she grew to love so deeply, was too much for her to bear. She left the study. She did not slam the door. Slamming doors was for people with healthy lungs. She found him by accident 2 nights later, but in the chapel attached to the family crypt, where her mother's name was carved into stone, above an empty alcove meant for Leora herself. He was sitting in the front pew, with a ledger open on his knees. Not a devotional text, but the household accounts, the ones that tracked Reneth's care payments to the church, the quarterly donations that purchased 30 minutes of access. He was adding figures. At 1 a.m, in the dark, he was adding figures. 17,000 mark, he said without looking up. He must have heard her footsteps. That is what I have paid, over 6 years, to rent a child I stole, and now I am calculating how much of that I can offset against the Irene dowry. He closed the ledger. The sound was very final. Your mother would have known what to call a man who does arithmetic like this. I've been avoiding the word for a long time. Reneth sat in his cell. They called it a chamber, furnished it with a narrow bed and a prayer bench and a window too high to see anything but sky, and told himself that Leora's coolness was a punishment, a tantrum, the petulance of a girl who had been denied what she wanted and was sulking about it. He told himself this for approximately 4 minutes before the lie collapsed. She had asked him to say it plainly. He hadn't. She had offered him the truth without ornament, and he had wrapped it in doctrine and handed it back, because doctrine was safe, and the truth was a country he did not have a map for. He pressed his palms flat against the stone wall and felt the cold seep into them. Without the solar reliquary, the great glass and gold apparatus in the sanctum that safely dispersed the damage his healings drew out, his hands ached constantly. The reliquary was the church's leash. It made his gifts sustainable, channeled the pain and sickness he absorbed into light and heat that dissipated harmlessly. Without it, every healing ate him from the inside. Through his door, he could hear priests passing in the corridor. 2 voices he recognized, Brother Taven and Father Aldrich. Engagement to Noel is all but formal. Noah sent an emissary last week to inquire about the betrothal terms. Officially a courtesy, but Severin says the crown is watching. The physicians, apparently. Some vapor treatment. Severin calls it heresy, dressed as medicine, but Noel published the results anyway. If the girl is cured without the saint, what does she need him for? Reneth's hands went cold against the stone. What does she need him for? He felt faint and had to support himself with his arm. What does she need him for? Then he felt the sheer animal terror of a creature whose usefulness was the only reason it had been kept alive. Chapter 6. Below the Heart. 3 sessions later, he broke the choreography. It began like every other treatment. Leora seated with her spine straight, Reneth kneeling before her, hands positioned with ritual precision. Brother Taven stood at the door, silent witness, everything observed, everything correct. Reneth's right hand rested over her heart as always, fingers spread across the delicate fabric of her bodice, palm radiating the familiar controlled warmth into the damaged tissue beneath. His left hand circled her wrist, thumb resting lightly against her pulse. 6 years of flawless repetition. Then his right hand drifted. It moved with agonizing slowness, barely an inch downward, slipping past the approved boundary to the soft, yielding curve just below her ribs. There, his fingers settled against the warm fabric, pressing with a new, searching pressure. The heat that had always been medicinal deepened into something velvet and deliberate, sinking through cloth and skin like a secret whispered against her body. His thumb traced a slow, feather-light path along the lower swell, following the hidden contour as if memorizing the shape of her breath itself. Leora's breath caught sharply in her throat, not from the familiar ache of mistlung, but from the sudden electric awareness of being touched with intention. 6 years of careful, supervised neutrality shattered in that single, forbidden glide of his palm. From Taven's angle behind, and to the left, the movement remained invisible. The saint's hand appeared perfectly placed, as chaste and professional as ever. But Leora felt every nuance, the subtle weight of his fingers, the way his warmth seemed to bloom and linger against the tender place beneath her heart, the faint tremor in his touch that betrayed him. She lifted her gaze to his face. Reneth was staring at his own hand as though it had betrayed him. His expression was raw, shame and hunger braided so tightly together they formed a single, devastating emotion. His eyes were dark with it, lashes low, lips parted just enough to reveal the uneven rhythm of his breathing. He wanted this. He's always wanted this. And now he's horrified, because he could no longer pretend otherwise. Thank you for listening to part 1 of The Saint in the Glass Garden. If you enjoyed the story and want more cozy, dark romance storytelling like this, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what you think and where you think their fates will lead. It really helps support the channel and lets me know to keep going. I'll see you in the next chapter.